Reform, alter, or abolish government. That was George Mason 3 weeks before Thomas Jefferson and the Declaration of Independence. On June 12, 1776, Virginia made that rebellion the law. Not theory, not hope. They didn't ask for permission. They said just take it, whether the government likes it or not. So on this episode, we're digging into that long-forgotten and ignored founding document, the Virginia Declaration of Rights, where power comes from, why governments even exist, and what the people have the right to do when it all goes off the rails. But first of all, before getting to that, welcome, and thank you for joining me here on the Path to Liberty. My name is Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for Wednesday, June 11th, 2025. And to first understand how radical this declaration was, primarily written by George Mason, and of course why it mattered so much, we've got to back up just a few months, because by the time June 12th, 1776 came around, Virginia was already acting like an independent country. Hear from Mike Meharry. He said months before the 13 colonies approved the Declaration of Independence, Virginia was already operating as a free and independent state. The colonial governor, he wrote, fled in January of 1776 after the burning of Norfolk. In his absence, the governor's council and the House of Burgesses dissolved themselves into a convention under the authority of the people and assumed control over colonial affairs. This wasn't just theory. The royal government in Virginia was already gone, and a de facto one was already formed and preparing to secede from Britain. And here from the resolution of the Virginia Convention, passed May 15, 1776. By a late act, all these colonies are declared to be in rebellion and out of the protection of the British Crown. Our properties are subjected to confiscation. Our people, when captivated, compelled to join in the murder and plunder of their relations and countrymen, and all former oppression of Americans declared legal and just. Now, next up, the convention, the resolution. Well, they knew they were faced with destruction and had only two options, and they put it like this. In this state of extreme danger, we have no alternative left but an abject submission to the will of those overbearing tyrants, or a total separation from the crown and government of Great Britain, uniting and exerting the strength of all America for defense, and forming alliances with foreign powers for commerce and aid in war. Now, next up, the convention officially declared that reconciliation with the British was basically gone. There was no chance of this. And they instructed their delegates to the Second Continental Congress. This was an instruction to introduce a Declaration of Independence. They said, resolved unanimously that the delegates appointed to represent this colony in the General Congress be instructed to propose to that respectable body to declare the United Colonies free and independent states, absolved from all allegiance to or dependence upon the Crown or Parliament of Great Britain. And just a short time after that, again, this was May 15th, on June 7th, Richard Henry Lee did just that. He stood before the Second Continental Congress and introduced what became known as the Lee Resolution, which set the stage for the Declaration of Independence. I covered that in much more detail in an episode just last week, the forgotten resolutions that actually started independence. That'll be in the show notes after the live stream is done. But let's get back to Virginia, because while the Continental Congress was still debating whether or not they were going to declare independence now or after they had an Articles of Confederation, whatever order they were going to do this, Virginia was basically already putting it down as law, because on June 12th, 1776, The Fifth Virginia Revolutionary Convention, I think I've got that order of those terms right. They adopted a Declaration of Rights, as I mentioned earlier, was primarily drafted by George Mason. We had a little help on that from people like James Madison, who was very young at the time. But it basically opened up with a pretty radical foundation about liberty and power, especially at the time. And some of this might sound a little familiar too. Section 1, that all men are by nature equally free and independent, and have certain inherent rights, of which, when they enter into a state of society, they cannot by any compact deprive or divest their posterity, namely the enjoyment of life and liberty, with the means of acquiring and possessing property, and pursuing and obtaining happiness and safety. Now, as Mike Meharry points out, he said, in the years leading up to the Revolution, and this next point is very important, Americans started to question the British conception of political power, basically talking about sovereignty or final authority. For the British, sovereignty was in the king or the king in parliament. Government had final say over the power of government. And he said they began to think of a constitution as something that exists above the government. And of course, a constitution was a creation of the people. He said the colonists began to reject the idea that government formed the Constitution and instead conceived of the Constitution as something that binds the government. He says, we see this shift in the first several articles of the Virginia Declaration of Rights, particularly this one next, Section 2, that all power is vested in and consequently derived from the people, that magistrates are their trustees and servants, and at all times amenable to them. And this is the foundation, what they actually set things up under to be like under the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution for the United States as well, that government is merely an agent of the people of the several states and not their master. And of course, we see this same kind of principle reflected in the Declaration of Independence, July 4th, 1776, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. And this is where, when we go to the next section, Section 3, where Mason stopped writing about theory, because it didn't just justify rebellion, it basically made it law. He said that government is, or ought to be, instituted for the common benefit, protection, and security of the people, nation, or community. And that when any government shall, not some, not most, not all, not just the ones over there, but when any government shall be found inadequate or contrary to these purposes, a majority of the community has an indubitable, inalienable, and indefeasible right to reform, alter, or abolish it in such manner as shall be judged most conducive to the public weal. It wasn't about asking government to stop doing the things that they weren't supposed to be doing in the first place, because it's up to the people as the source of all power, government as their agent, just their servant. When the people decide that they're going to change government, government doesn't get to say no. Well, they generally try to, but ultimately, this is the foundation. Now, nearly a century before Mason put this on paper, John Locke laid down the same principle in his two treatises. When government violates the trust, it's really a trust that it has been given. The power that has been delegated to that government goes back to where it started, the people. He said, for all power given with trust for the attaining an end, being limited by that end, whenever that end is manifestly neglected or opposed, the trust must necessarily be forfeited. I mean, that's pretty final there. He said, and the power devolve into the hands of those that gave it, who may place it anew where they shall think best for their safety and security. And you can see the lineage of this from Locke, and actually before him as well, to people like George Mason, and then, of course, in the Declaration of Independence. But in the meantime, we also have Jean-Jacques Burlamaqui in his Principles of Natural and Politic Law, 1747-ish. This is the guy who I often reference as most likely the influence for the phrase pursuit of happiness, which we saw a version of from George Mason as well. He followed Locke with that same view in 1747-ish. If the sovereign, utterly forgetful of the end for which he was entrusted with the sovereignty, applied it to a quite contrary purpose, and thus became an enemy to the state, this is a mouthful here, because if someone's been trusted with power or authority over any situation, and they do things to the opposite of it, they're not just making bad choices. They're not just bad politicians, bad governors, bad magistrates. They're an enemy to the people. They're an enemy of our liberty. Anyways, Burlamaqui continued with this. In that situation, the sovereignty returns ipso facto to the nation, who in that case can act towards the person who was their sovereign in the manner they think most agreeable to their security and interests. Now, I realize I am blasting through a lot of really important historical information pretty quickly here, but my hope is that this episode serves as a sort of a highlight reel for you. And if you're interested in learning more, you're in luck, because the TAC has it covered. After every single episode, we publish a blog post for each show. And in it, you're not only going to find all the various platforms we're on. Of course, we have the video platforms and the audio-only podcast platforms. We're all over the place. If we're missing from your favorite, please let us know. We'll try to get there as well. But Alan Mosley organizes this blog post and includes a show links section with all the reference things that I'm mentioning, all the reference links and source documents that I'm mentioning in the show, generally in the order that I go through them in each episode, as long as I did a good job with my show notes for Alan. But Alan's like basically a security blanket for me. I know that this is going to get done. I'm so grateful for him being so consistent and on it, and we should all be very grateful for the work that he's doing at a very low cost. So thank you, Alan. But I'll get that published over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. It's all spelled out a couple of hours after this live stream is done. But anyways, let's get back to it. We're talking about George Mason and the Virginia Declaration of Rights passed June 12th, 1776. And in Section 5, we're jumping ahead a little bit, Mason gave us both separation of powers and term limits. And for the latter, he explained why. I'll get to the why on the separation of powers in a moment. But here's Section 5, that the legislative and executive powers of the state should be separate and distinct from the judiciary, and that the members of the two first may be restrained from oppression by feeling and participating in the burdens of the people. They should, at fixed periods, be reduced to a private station, return into that body from which they were originally taken. Now, the separation of powers part, that comes straight from the celebrated Montesquieu, is how Madison referred to him. Montesquieu's The Spirit of Laws in 1748, one of the most influential tracts on the founders and old revolutionaries, and maybe the foundational text on separation of powers. When you don't have it, according to Montesquieu, liberty is toast. Here's how he put it, though. When the legislative and executive powers are united in the same person or in the same body of magistrates, there can be no liberty. Not a decent amount, not some, not a little, none. Why? He said, because apprehensions may arise, lest the same monarch or senate should enact tyrannical laws to execute them in a tyrannical manner. And then he continues a little further. Again, there is no liberty if the judiciary power be not separated from the legislative and executive. And Montesquieu explained why for this as well. He said, were it joined with the legislative, the life and liberty of the subject would be exposed to arbitrary control. For the judge would be then the legislator. Were it joined to the executive power, the judge might behave with violence and oppression. Now, hear from Kevin Gutzman over at Constituting America, an article that he wrote over a decade ago, but very timeless stuff. He points out that Mason didn't just lay this philosophical foundation for the Declaration of Independence and the groundwork for secession from the empire. He also gave us a model for the Bill of Rights. And I've seen people say this, but I don't know if I have proof anywhere, that James Madison, when he was proposing those amendments for the Bill of Rights in June of 1789, he gave his speech. He didn't call it a Bill of Rights, but he was proposing amendments to the Constitution. He basically had a copy of the Virginia Declaration of Rights with him as he worked on this. They say the Committee of Five that drafted the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson as the lead, they had a copy of the Virginia Declaration of Rights. I mean, this could be just kind of hearsay, but it's somewhat the tradition. But anyways, so we get a model for the Bill of Rights years before there was even a Constitution. And here's how Kevin puts it. The Declaration next turns to what we take to be individual rights. Section 8 enumerates several important rights of criminal defendants, including the right against self-incrimination, the right to confront one's accusers and other witnesses, the right to a speedy trial, and the right of trial by jury. There's a lot of stuff that came right from, using the same term there, right from the Virginia Declaration of Rights. Kevin continues. Section 9 echoes the English Bill of Rights back in the 17th century in banning excessive bail and cruel and unusual punishments, language that would become the Eighth Amendment to the United States Constitution in 1791. And then Section 12 holds up freedom of the press as one of, quote, the greatest bulwarks of liberty. And then next, in Section 13, George Mason put to paper what all the founders and old revolutionaries agreed upon, that large, permanent standing armies, a military apparatus to enforce arbitrary government power, well, that's total death to liberty. And here, Section 13, that a well-regulated militia composed of the body of the people. Again, the militia is the body of the people to George Mason. He said the same thing in the ratification debates over the Constitution, very consistent with his principles. A well-regulated militia composed of the body of the people, trained to arms, is the proper, natural, and safe defense of a free state. That's an important qualifier. That standing armies in time of peace should be avoided as dangerous to liberty, and that in all cases, military should be under strict subordination to and governed by the civil power. Now, years later, we can see how this influence was very strong. It's not that it came from George Mason, but it certainly got a little weight there as well. Henry Knox, the first Secretary of War, this was under President George Washington, he hammered home this same principle in 1790. But whoever seriously and candidly estimates the power of discipline and the tendency of military habits will be constrained to confess that whatever may be the efficacy of a standing army in war, it cannot in peace be considered as friendly to the rights of human nature. Again, the foundation is natural rights. We see that right at the beginning of George Mason's text. We see this here talking about self-defense and preservation, the security of a free state, regarding the rights of human nature from Henry Knox. And he continued, an energetic national militia is to be regarded as the capital security of a free republic and not a standing army forming a distinct class in the community. Now, I covered the founders' views on a standing army versus a militia in what I think is one of my most important episodes ever. This is back in early 2024, Militia versus Standing Army, the founders' view. It will be linked to in the show notes. I do hope you check it out if you haven't yet, or maybe you want to give it another run sometime soon. Now, the Virginia Declaration of Rights wasn't just the first written Declaration of Rights from any American revolutionary government. It also became the blueprint for pretty much everyone else. Hear from Bob Ruppert over at All Things Liberty, the Journal of the American Revolution. He wrote, after the Declaration of Independence, each colony assumed statehood, or independency, I guess, and adopted a Bill of Rights. Most copied the Virginia Declaration of Rights. Benjamin Franklin made a few slight changes and a few additions, and the Virginia Declaration of Rights became the Pennsylvania Bill of Rights. Similar action, he points out, was taken by Vermont, New Hampshire, New York, Delaware, Rhode Island, Maryland, and North Carolina. I mean, when George Mason said in the Virginia Ratifying Convention, hey, I think we should get some amendments to this Constitution, we should get a Bill of Rights, and if you approve a committee to do this, I can get this done pretty quickly. He meant it. Anyways, before going fully off track there, Bob points out that even John Adams was highly influenced when he wrote the Massachusetts Bill of Rights. It was only Mason's freedom of religion, which I think had mostly the influence of James Madison, that John Adams was uncomfortable with. And this influence from the Virginia Declaration of Rights, this copycat from other states, it didn't end at state lines, and it didn't end just in America. And Kevin Gutzman put it like this: the influence of the Virginia Declaration of Rights would be hard to exaggerate. Many of its provisions were used in other states, as we just saw. Thomas Jefferson, helping Frenchmen draft their revolution's Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, saw to it that some of the Virginia provisions were essentially translated into that document. From France, he wrote, their language made its way into the charters of several Francophone countries, and eventually into the UN version, of all places. From there, it would be transplanted into yet more countries. And in an 1825 letter, Thomas Jefferson gave George Mason his due with this: the fact is unquestionable that the Bill of Rights and the Constitution of Virginia were drawn originally by George Mason, one of our really great men and of the first order of greatness. June 12, 1776, rebellion to tyrants was made law in Virginia, and was followed weeks later by the Declaration of Independence. I think, if anything, June 12th should really be a national holiday. But because of the government-run and government-approved so-called education system, hardly anyone today has even heard of the Virginia Declaration of Rights, and probably even fewer know anything about George Mason. And since the 10th Amendment Center was founded 19 years ago this month, June of 2006, this has been a big part of the reason why we work so hard, day in and day out, month in and month out. 19 years, year in and year out, to reach and teach more and more people about this forgotten and totally ignored history. To teach more and more people about these essential principles from the founders and the old revolutionaries. And nothing helps us do this work more than the financial faith and support of our members. If you got a couple of bucks of that dirty government fiat that they keep devaluing day in and day out, year in and year out, please consider throwing it our way. No one punches above their weight class better than the TAC. Our membership program starts out at just $2 a month. We also have annual, 5-year, and lifetime options. You can find all that over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. And if you don't want to become a member, but still want to help us out financially, that's totally awesome. Totally cool by me. Whatever works for you works best for me. Or if you already are a member, I'm very grateful for that. And you want to pitch in additional, especially to help us out celebrate or commemorate our anniversary later this month, just want to make sure you have the place you can get that done. It's 10thamendmentcenter.com/donate, all spelled out, 10thamendmentcenter.com/donate. Of course, there's a bunch of other non-financial things you can do to help us spread the word. Hit the like button, leave reviews on Apple Podcasts or any other podcast platform, comments in the archive, share links, subscribe, get notifications, watch time percentage. A 10-minute video with 30 minutes watch time, that's 300%, is really, really good for the algorithms. All that stuff, whether it's financial otherwise, or a combination. I'm very, very grateful for your support. I'm so glad you stuck around all the way to the end. Thank you so much for being here. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope it was interesting, maybe a little entertaining from time to time, but more important than anything, I hope this made you think, and I hope you learned something. Again, I really appreciate you spending some of your time with me today, and I look forward to seeing you next time here on the Path to Liberty.